Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm hesitant, I guess, and a little bit uncomfortable today to be speaking on this bill, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the great honor and privilege it is for me to represent the people of North Island, Powell River. And one of the things that is unique and wonderful about the region that I represent is that I represent over 20 Indigenous communities that come from the Kwakwaka'wakw peoples, the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples, and the Coast Salish peoples. I'm very proud to represent the northernmost part of the Coast Salish territory. You know, I've learned a lot from those communities, and I know from them how important language is. And I am also very proud that in Campbell River this fall, we're going to have our first kindergarten immersion program speaking Kwakwaka'wakw, or so Kwakwala. I usually can say that, but today's a bad day. I must be tired. And so that's going to be in Campbell River, which is so amazing because it allows a portion of the Indigenous community that I represent in that particular community to send their children to school learning their first language. And I'm just so proud of that work. So I think it's important that we recognize on the ground how much work is actually being done in communities across this country, how many Indigenous communities and the communities around them are working with them to make these things a reality. My granny lost her language. She went away to residential school from the ages of 4 to 16, and when she came home, she didn't have a lot of memory of her language. My auntie, her daughter, also the hereditary chief in my family, named Hadawaks-Kawa, which means peace within the frame of a house, now teaches language in our community. So it's amazing when the work is done, when the focus is there, what communities can do. And when I look at this piece of legislation and when I heard about it initially, I felt a lot of excitement and pride in the work that the communities I represent and the community I am from and the work that they have done. But I am struggling. And I think it's important that when we are in this House, that we remember that as legislators, our jobs are to struggle. It's to not look at things simply, but to look at them in a more broad and complex framework and make sure that we are humble as we walk in that path. Because when we make decisions, we're making decisions on behalf of the many, many people in our regions that we represent. So one of the biggest struggles that I have in this place is that so little is being done, but it's better than nothing. And at some point, I think it's important that we say that a little bit better is not just better than nothing. It's not justice. And in this country, and in the history of this country, and its relationship with the first people of this land, justice has never been a reality. And where justice happens, it happens because the people themselves do the work to make that justice a reality. So I just want to speak to the fact that it is hard because this bill aims to protect and preserve Indigenous languages. It does not reflect the key recommendations that were made in committee by language experts to do that work. We need to sit with that. Recommendations that are needed to meet the objective of protecting and preserving these languages were not accepted. I want to be very clear. From my perspective and the reality in which I've grown up, these languages were stolen, literally beaten out of children. So when we look at the responsibility of this place to be a part of protecting that, to bringing back those language keepers, to making sure that we're passing that on to the next generation, we need to be accountable for that, all of us, because it's our job as legislators. Language is the reality around you. Many elders have said to me, language is based on the land. It is based on the relationship the people had with the land and how the people act towards one another on the land that they live on. That is pretty fundamental. So when we think about the languages that we have in this country and the fact that we don't know them, so many of us, it means we don't know the relationship of the people with this land. We don't know how the people interacted with the land, and we don't know how they treated each other. I don't even know how to explain how important this is and what a lack it is. So when I think of the elders and the wisdom that they've given me and how they've had to translate that language into languages that I understand, I'm just incredibly humbled and grateful. And I am always aware that there is so much that I don't even begin to understand. And what an honor it is to be in that place and that they allow me to make all the mistakes that I make. So when we look at this bill, the other concern that I have, the other issue that I am struggling with is the financial resources are not stable and they are not long-term. So how will this allow for the activity to continue and for long-term planning to occur? You know, I think recently I was at an event with the Klahoos, the Tla'amin, the Hamalko, and the Comox First Nation in my region. And they are relatives, and they came together and they created a language site where they were sharing languages, and all of these elders were saying words, and it's all recorded so we can keep this, so we can protect it and pass it on to the children. 2 of my children are part of that process. And I looked at the great work that they were doing, but one of their challenges was, how do we plan long term? When it's project to project to project, and we continue to hope that we have enough resources. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm here to say that I want more. I want better. I want justice. I feel like it's time. I feel like it's way beyond time. Another concern that I have is the fact that the Indigenous Language Commissioner has no guarantees on the extent of their powers and their capacity to represent the best interests of the many communities across this country. When I think about the work that the communities I represent are doing to protect their language, to protect the people who are the keepers of their language, to make sure that they are in a process of taking the language keepers and passing it on as teachers to the next generation, it is a sacred duty, it's a sacred commitment, and they are working so hard. I believe that there should be accountability in this place to know what's happening, to understand the challenges. And I think that this Indigenous Language Commissioner should have a significant role in this responsibility. You know, the other thing that really concerned me is that Inuit communities shared a lot of their concerns. The ITK suggested that there should in fact be Inuit-specific legislation, that the proposed Indigenous Language Commissioner is little more than a substitute for the Aboriginal Languages Initiative program, which failed, and really just oversaw the decline of Indigenous language in recent decades. When we hear testimony like that, we need to remember, as the people who don't understand the languages, there's a relationship there that we cannot fully comprehend, but we must honor it. We must recognize it. So here I am, standing in this place again, looking at another piece of legislation that starts something, and people are going to support it. Of course, the communities I represent want to see this because they want to see something. But again, it's a little bit better. It's better than it was before. It's something to hang our hats on, but it certainly does not go far enough. It does not get to the core issue, which is, what is our commitment in this country as the representatives of the place that stole the language, that stole it, that supported places that beat the language out of children. You know, one of the elders from my community used to say to me, Rachel, think about the first children that went to residential school and when they came home. And they were gone for years, and they came home and they couldn't speak our language. We couldn't speak to our own children. They were there and we were so happy they had finally come home, but they couldn't understand what we were saying to them. We are still not healed from that. So I think when we stand in this house and we think we understand and we propose things, that we have to remember Indigenous communities have paid long enough, so I will struggle with this decision. I will struggle out of respect for the communities that I represent, and I will struggle because even in the face of this adversity, they are still here. Like my granny said, you don't complain, Rachel, because we are still here. But I think we need to do better. I think we need to make sure that the people who are still here get to go so much further because we're going to do our due diligence and we're going to support them in doing that and recognize that they have a right to their language that was stripped. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate many of the comments the member opposite has put on the record this afternoon. And when I take a look at C91 as a bill, it is historic in the sense that when you take a look at the importance of language, as the member just finished illustrating quite eloquently, I must say, at the end of the day, when we have those calls for action, when we talk about reconciliation in the report, there's 3 calls for action that are actually being addressed within this legislation. And albeit it might not necessarily be perfect legislation, and I think we would all agree that it's not necessarily perfect, but we've waited a long time, generations. And for me personally, I believe it provides hope to the 15,000 plus people that are Indigenous background that I represent in Winnipeg North. And, you know, at the end of the day, I'm wondering if my colleague would agree with me that, that this legislation does move us forward on the whole idea of reconciliation and rectifying a wrong, and actually in a very tangible way providing that hope for future generations. And that's not even for Indigenous. You will find non-Indigenous people that not only support but also have an active interest in Indigenous languages too.
The Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I think about the practices in the family that I am married into. And the practice is that when you talk about the serious, hard things, you pause. You take a moment. You reflect. And that is certainly not something that is in the culture of this place, which I think is really unfortunate. And often we're put in time crunches where we're being pushed very quickly to respond to many things. And I accept that that is part of the challenge of this place. And I would obviously say that I think if a lot of Indigenous elders came into this place and helped us work through some of these things, we would certainly be all a lot richer and more fulfilled as human beings in this place. So I guess my response to the member is simply this. I'm tired of a little bit being enough. When you have starved people and you give them a small amount of food, it feels like everything. My struggle is, when do we finally acknowledge that we need to give so much more?
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Member for Souris Moose Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member from North Island Powell River for her speech, and I welcome her on board with the Veteran Affairs Committee, which she's recently joined with, and it's great to work with her. And she may, in her research, have recognized that before the study we're doing right now, we did a study on Indigenous matters, and in particular, we got up into the northern part of Canada, up to Yellowknife, and when we were there, we met with a lot of our Canadian Rangers. And one of the things we found out there was multiple languages in the north. And I'm wondering if she might, I'd like to hear from her, Mr. Speaker, that what her thoughts might be on how this legislation might be of benefit to them or actually be a detriment to them.
For North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, and I am so honored to sit on the committee working for veterans in this country, and I appreciate working with him on those very important issues. My response would be, one of the funnest parts about language, and I think we should all be curious about multiple languages, and I think about my last event where we had the 4 nations I referred to earlier who had put together a website with different words, and we're looking at how to merge sentences and all of that part as you learn a language, and how one community would say one word would be a little bit different than how another community would say the same similar word. So I think the nuances of languages, Indigenous languages across this country, are extremely profound. extremely mesmerizing, and what an honor to learn them. I hope this legislation moves forward to engage with that a bit. I just don't think it's enough. I worry that it will be short-term and not long-term. A lot of the people that I've worked with in my riding that are focusing on Indigenous language talk about the need for stability in terms of resources to be able to do that long-term work. And so hopefully it will be a step in the right direction. I know that the Indigenous people will make it a step in the right direction because of their hard work. I just wish there was more.
Questions